Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
In today's hyper-polarized times, wouldn't it be refreshing if there was a blueprint for America's next president to unite the country around nonpartisan solutions to all the issues we care about? Well, that's exactly what Ryan Clancy and Margaret White of No Labels claim to have done in their new book, The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election, 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues That Matter. Today, we're fortunate to get to speak with Ryan Clancy, co-author of the book. Ryan is a senior advisor for No Labels, where he leads the development of policy and communications for the organization. He has helped some of the world's most respected leaders and organizations tell their story. Ryan is a graduate of Villanova University and lives in New York. He has also been on The State of Us several times in the past. Thanks for being here again with us, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
But of course, we couldn't begin this critical conversation on all the issues that matter without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Yes, I'm looking forward to today's show. So let's go ahead and dig in here with Ryan and start talking about the upcoming 2020 election.
So you've definitely put something that caught Lance and I's interest here, and the ultimate guide to the 2020 election. So what was the motivation to write this book, and who exactly is it for? Why does it matter?
You know, the jumping off point for this book is sort of that famous quote by the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who he said, "We're all entitled to our own opinion, but not our own facts." But the problem is we now do all have our own facts. And what we're realizing is that when we can't even agree where we actually are as a country, it's proving impossible to talk about where we're supposed to go. And so this book we kind of wrote as a guide for people just trying to make sense of this election and the issues that it's going to be fought over. The sort of analogy I use is, you know, like when you're playing Scrabble and somebody throws out a word, you're not really sure it's a real word. So you go to the dictionary, right, to check. Let me make sure that's actually a word. It's kind of the same thing here. People are going to be hearing a lot of things during the election, and we hope they will use this book as a resource to make sense of what they're hearing.
Makes sense. So really this could be for anybody who's trying to make an informed decision about the next president. In fact, throughout the book, kind of at the end of each policy idea, for example, you include a list of questions, right, that somebody could ask a presidential candidate or elected official.
That's right, because you know, we are entering a period in which a lot of these candidates are going to be in your town,
right?
And a lot of people will be going to political events and town halls, and if they get a chance to ask a question, we give them some questions they can ask.
Right. And you've even broken it down for individuals, questions specific for President Trump, for example, questions for Democratic candidates, and kind of tailored those in such a way that makes it more meaningful when you're asking those given questions.
Yeah, we didn't want to put softballs in there. You know, we really tried to do our research on what is it that these candidates are actually selling, and here's some tough questions you can ask them to figure out what it actually means.
When I'm listening to what hopefully will be debates or them speaking, or if I wanted to try to get a hold of them through, you know, email or anything else, I could text, you know, email or text these questions to them and see if they'd answer. Or when I was watching on TV, kind of pull out my book, and there was a space for me then to jot down what their answers were when they were asked these different questions too, as well as whether I got to ask them in person, but I could also kind of follow along.
Yeah, we've got in the book, you'll see there's spaces to take notes. Yep. So, you know, we hope that by the end of, you know, this election, people have got, like, you know, their copies are dog-eared and beaten up and, you know, with notes in them.
Mine already is. So
good.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish.
No, it's a workbook.
Exactly.
You know,
that's what made it really nice. Well, about one of those things here, I found that this was very interesting when I read this. You did a thing on, you know, trying to bring everybody together, and, you know, by everybody, I mean to unite Republicans and Democrats. And just real quickly, you say in here in 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Today, 87% do. 20 years ago, most Americans opposed same-sex marriage. Today, 61% support it. So prejudice, it appears, is on the decline. except in the one area of politics. And that has to do with that in 2012, Stanford researchers dug in historical polling data to find that Americans are increasingly likely to say they'd be angry if their child married someone from the opposite political party. And that just kind of floored me when you think about someone that your children, decide to spend their entire life with, the rest of their life with, that you would be against that because of their political persuasion. So in that current political climate with that there, is there any kind of legitimate hope that we can ever get everybody to work together again?
Yeah. Part of it is a chicken or egg question, is that, the American people really are angry. And yet, unfortunately, the politicians kind of just stoke it. And one of the things I think is really a little bit depressing is that we have so many moments where if you're a politician and there's kind of this anger and division, and you have a choice to make. You can either pour water on that fire or pour gas. And oftentimes they reach for the gas. And, it's true of the president. It's true of some of his biggest antagonists. They just talk and communicate in a way that is designed to divide. So I think the challenge is that on the actual issues, and we talk about this in the book, there is a lot more common ground than people think on the specific substantive issues. Part of the problem is that being a Democrat or a Republican now has become so much more than like a collection of policy beliefs. It's like a part of your identity, right. And it's become really tribal. And that's what we're trying to help break through. So you do think there's some hope here? You give some ideas, and I don't want to get into that. I think we're going to talk about that later. But do you think there is? I thought there was. And then as I read this, you kind of you kind of got me to think maybe it's not, maybe the problem's too deep seated than even I realized it was. No, look, the hopeful alternative to that is when you look at poll questions where, pollsters will ask people, look, would you prefer political leaders who just stick on principle, even if it means getting nothing done, or would you prefer ones who want to work together? Overwhelmingly, people say, well, I want ones that work together. There was a poll last month where it was saying, it asked people, looking at the current presidential candidate field, would you like to vote for someone who's further to the right, further to the left, more in the center? 61% say more in the center.
Exactly.
And so I do actually think that, if Washington could start to actually achieve things, right, and actually solve problems, it would actually have the effect of dissipating some of this anger. Because I think what drives people crazy is Washington typically just does nothing. And in the absence of Washington doing anything, I think there's actually, this really bad irony in which when the system gets worse, it actually makes it better for the people who will keep making it worse. And what I mean by that is when government can't do anything, then Americans become more open to leaders who come along and just say, the whole thing is corrupt. Let's just burn the whole thing down. And that never works.
Very well stated. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting too, Ryan, the way that you just phrased that. I think often people don't seem to fully understand, and I was just sharing this with somebody the other day, the gridlock benefits all of those people that are currently there, right? It doesn't benefit the rest of us. And understanding that maintaining that gridlock only serves to drive the rest of us further apart is so important, so that hopefully the rest of us hold our leaders to account and make that positive progress. Part of what we want to look at, of course, is the subtitle of the book, right? 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues That Matter. Now, we don't have a time to go over all 101, sadly, but there's a lot of good and interesting stuff here that Lance and I have reviewed. And a couple of the topics that we want to hit are healthcare, energy and climate change, the rise of big tech, and the magic money tree. And actually, I want to start here real briefly with the magic money tree. So this is referring to the national debt, right? This idea that currently our government's spending about $1 trillion more than it brings in tax revenues annually.
Yeah. And by the way, this is at a time when unemployment is at a 50-year low, The stock market is at an all-time high. And yet here we are with trillion-dollar deficits. And I think people really need to understand how unusual and problematic that is. I mean, typically the way it's supposed to work is when the economy is going well, the deficit shrinks and maybe you even get a surplus. And that lets you have a little bit of a rainy day buffer for when a recession happens and inevitably the deficit spikes. And so what this is telling us is that it wouldn't take much of a recession to take that deficit to go from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion. And that's just not sustainable.
Something that I thought you mentioned in the book that was really eye-opening about the national debt is something, my guess is that a lot of people don't remember, and that's this difference between the mandatory versus discretionary spending and how it's made the problem significantly worse in recent years in terms of the money that Congress actually makes decisions about how things are going to be spent. In the book, you write, 50 years ago, the federal government spent twice as much on discretionary, i.e. future-oriented spending, as it did mandatory. Now the ratio is flipped, with the government spending twice as much on mandatory as discretionary, and this disparity will keep growing over time. So understanding mandatory spending, the 69% share includes programs like Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments on the debt, and it refers to ongoing obligations the government is legally required to pay every year, things like interest, on the debt itself. Mandatory spending typically goes to fund consumption right now, here in the present moment. Then you explain that discretionary spending, the 31% share, discretionary spending, must be appropriated each year, and that includes everything else that Congress fights over when trying to pass a budget. Discretionary spending often represents investments in the future. So these could be things like medical research or education, those sorts of things. So I think what's really telling here, and the message that people have to be sure to take away about the national debt, is what's happened is just 50 years ago, it was the opposite of the way it is now. There was way more discretionary spending, the money that Congress chose to appropriate every year. Now there's way more mandatory spending. Almost 70% of the budget is mandatory, things that we are legally obligated to pay for. And that's only going to keep getting worse as the debt goes up. And I think a lot of people they don't understand that. It's not that they don't understand it. It's that they don't realize that that's the situation. And that's why we have to do something, because if we don't, it'll just keep getting worse. And that will further erode Congress's ability to actually do anything on an ongoing basis. We've been talking with Ryan Clancy. He's the co-author of a new book called The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election, 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues That Matter. There's a lot more to discuss here. We're going to go over some things like healthcare, climate change, privacy, and the rise of big tech in America. But before we do that, it's important that we remind listeners the whole reason that we're having conversations like this is because all the radio programs and podcasts on TrueChat pursue a common goal, and that's to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. We're trying to get that done, and remember, you can join the conversation at thestateofus.org. Thestateofus.org, our website, has all the different ways to connect with us on social media and all the different ways that you can tune in to this program. Remember, it's both a podcast and syndicated radio program, so head to thestateofus.org to find all the different ways to listen. We've got plenty more to talk about with Ryan Clancy from No Labels. Keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we're fortunate to get to speak with Ryan Clancy. He's the co-author of The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election, 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues That Matter. So far, we've had the opportunity to break down a little bit the realistic possibility of getting our nation's leaders onto the same page, but also we've dived into the national debt, or the magic money tree as it has been dubbed so far in the book. We're going to go on now and talk about a few more of the things that stood out to Lance and I, and one of those is healthcare, a contentious issue for sure, and one that neither side seems to be able to make much headway on. So what's the reasonable path forward here, Ryan?
it's not what either side is really offering at the moment, to be honest. I mean, you look at the Republican side, they had unified control of the government for 2 years. They had the House, they had the Senate. They didn't manage to get healthcare reform passed. So what House Republicans have done in the last decade is they've managed to try to repeal Obamacare 70 times, but they haven't managed to actually come up with an alternative. And part of the reason is because they refuse to reckon with the actual trade-offs that exist in the healthcare system. So you take something like the pre-existing condition. Everybody loves that protection, that no insurance company can deny you coverage if you have a pre-existing condition. But what's the challenge with that? Well, people with pre-existing conditions tend to be more costly. And so if you tell insurance companies they have to cover those people, then that's generally going to make healthcare more expensive, and some people can't afford it. So you have to give people subsidies to buy it. And what I just described to you is the basic structure of Obamacare. And so Republicans just haven't offered a way to reckon with that. But on the other side, you look at what the left of the Democratic Party is offering right now, a Medicare for all proposal, which entails banning private health insurance, which 180 million people have. So, and by the way, most people with their health insurance, they're pretty happy with it. And so the idea that is the only way forward as a country, to sort of either, try to just tear down Obamacare on one side, or kind of do this one size fits all Medicare for all program, it's just not politically realistic. It's not fiscally realistic. And there's a lot of different ways you could get at the issue.
And I'm one of those people that I'm happy with my health care per se, but I think one reason everybody is happy with their health care that have it is because they know it. And I think people are afraid of change. So that doesn't mean that there maybe aren't any good things out there, but we are comfortable with what we know, especially when it comes to healthcare, because it's so difficult to deal with. But I agree with your answer. Next question is, we know that a large number of Americans care about climate change. Is it realistic to get the deniers/Republicans on board with any solution?
Well, there's nothing in Congress that is moving, but there is an idea that has pretty broad bipartisan support that is moving elsewhere. It's actually supported by a pretty big coalition of business and environmental groups. And the idea is called carbon fee and dividend. And the basic idea behind it is the government puts a fee on carbon, which over time will make it more expensive and incent the investment in renewable technologies. But importantly, the cost of that gets rebated right back to the American people. So on net, they're not paying any more. They're getting their money back. And interestingly enough, there's actually sort of a model for this, and it's Alaska. So Alaska has, since the 70s, they have their oil fields, which create royalties, and every citizen of Alaska gets a dividend check based on that. So there's a model for it. And the reason that this could maybe bridge the right-left divide is it addresses climate change in a serious way, which of course people on the left right, but it does so using a really strong market incentive, which folks on the right tend to like, as opposed to a very heavy-handed top-down government mandate dictating, which technologies we're going to invest in and how much.
In the first segment of the show, we talked a little bit about the national debt. And one of the things I think that is clear about issues like that is while people have a basic understanding of maybe what they want, like, for example, people want there to be no national debt, they don't always necessarily have a good understanding of the issue itself, and therefore don't know what they want their lawmakers to do. I think one of the other issues that this is true of is privacy. Since the 2016 election and the news surrounding Cambridge Analytica's role in the election interference, many Americans are concerned about their privacy and the rise of big tech. But much like the national debt, aren't necessarily certain about what they should be advocating for. So how do we continue to encourage capitalism, but at the same time prevent out-of-control tech companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough issue. And the sort of kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding how the whole tech economy grew up is in the mid-90s. There was this something called the Communications Decency Act, and it had a little provision buried in it. It was called Section 230. And what it basically meant was that an internet company could not be held accountable legally for things that people said on its platform. So the analogy would sort of be, in the early days, like if I went on AOL in a chat room and made a bunch of negative remarks about a restaurant, so that restaurant sucks. Well, the restaurant could not then sue AOL for libeling them, right? And that protection is what allowed the internet to grow up. And it was probably the right decision at the time. The issue now is the internet companies have gotten so big and so influential, and they're so far-reaching that maybe it's time to take another look at this. And you gotta do this really carefully. You don't want a situation where you just open up the floodgates of liability and then suddenly Facebook is getting sued for any crazy thing somebody says or does. But there is, and there needs to be found some kind of middle ground where tech companies just take more responsibility for what's on their platforms. But they got to do it in a way that, doesn't impinge free speech.
So Ryan, is this, as we're talking about this, as you're going through it, it sounds like this is one of those issues that really hasn't become partisan yet. And what I mean by that is not that Republicans and Democrats don't have a different perspective, but certain things, for example, like climate change or abortion, these typically have pretty clear party lines already established. Privacy is just something we all want, right? Am I on the right track here, or am I a little off base?
This is very much not a right-left issue. You see people on the right and the left very angry at the tech companies, even though it's for different reasons. And so, look, there's really two separate issues we're talking about here. There's the issue of like content that appears on these platforms, and that hits a lot of the hot buttons around, the 2016 election and, fake news and all that kind of stuff. And what can and should tech companies do to police that? The privacy thing is a little bit of a separate issue, but it's no less important. I mean, I don't think people quite recognize when they are using Gmail or Google or Facebook how much personal data they unwillingly hand over to these companies, which, of course, that is their entire business model, is because they have such a granular understanding of who you are and how you behave on the internet, that allows them to precisely target ads at you. So, I think one of the things we talk about in the book that's so important is there really does need to be a federal privacy standard. The reason being, a lot of states have privacy standards, but they're different. And, some of them are kind of, reactive, meaning they only kind of go into effect when there's some kind of privacy breach, and then it dictates what's supposed to happen. Some of them are proactive. It kind of demands companies take more aggressive measures to protect privacy. And that's really not good for anybody. I mean, it's certainly not good for the companies who have to comply to 50 different privacy standards. So there is some stuff working through Congress on privacy, and hopefully it gets over the finish line.
Yeah, the key is obviously making sure that something gets over the finish line. I think that's part of, right, this whole notion, and this thing that people are struggling with now is feeling like Congress doesn't get anything done. But that's basically what we've been talking about today. It's not that Congress can't necessarily get anything done. It's that a lot of people don't understand what they should be advocating for. There's a lot of division, and that's what No Labels is working on. And that's why we've got this new book, and we've got the co-author, Ryan Clancy, here with us, The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election, 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues that Matter. So far, we've talked some about, is this concept of no labels a pipe dream? We established that no, it's not. We've gone over healthcare. We've discussed climate change. We've even gotten into privacy in America. But believe it or not, there's still more to come. This book, despite being a pretty easy read, has quite a lot of content in it and a lot of things to get through. And this is only a small selection from the book. Believe it or not, there's a lot more stuff in it. So we're going to keep this conversation going. We're going to look at next how we stack up in comparison to other nations in regards to our citizen voting share. We're also going to look at earmarks. Could they actually be a surprising solution to helping break gridlock? Keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
In today's hyper-polarized times, wouldn't it be refreshing if there was a blueprint for America's next president to unite the country around nonpartisan solutions to all the issues we care about? Well, that's exactly what Margaret White and Ryan Clancy of No Labels claim to have done in their book. We're joined today by the co-author, Ryan Clancy, The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election, 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues That Matter. So far, we've talked about some of the hot button issues of healthcare, climate change, privacy, and the rise of big tech, along with whether or not it's a pipe dream to get Republicans and Democrats to unite around common goals. And the answer to all of this is, I think there's hope. I mean, that's exactly what this book that we've got in front of us today is all about. It's not that the solutions don't exist. It's just a matter of us, the voters, getting our lawmakers to believe and to get some of this stuff done. Before we continue with Ryan, though, I think it's important that we take a minute, Lance, and remind people why we're even having a conversation like this in the first place. All the podcasts on TrueChat's network pursue a common goal, right, Lance?
That we do. And our mission here at TrueChat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
Be sure to check out the website, thestateofus.org. You can find all the different ways to listen there. This is both a syndicated radio program and podcast. So be sure to check out thestateofus.org for the times and places that you can tune in. One of the main goals on The State of Us is to discuss solutions or talk about actionable items. Overall, the U.S. places just 26 out of 32 developed nations in citizen voting share. There's a lot of issues that this book touches on, Ryan, and the question, I guess, is, could one of the answers be to addressing a lot of this, to breaking gridlock? Is it truly just as simple as getting more of our citizens to go vote?
Yeah, it is. I know it's something people always say, but it is no less true. Our voting is terrible relative to other advanced countries. You know, you look at a country like Australia. Australia actually fines people for not voting, but I mean, their turnout is like 90%. You know, for us, in a good year, like in a presidential general election, you know, maybe you get over 60%. And the thing is that for the people who are concerned, and as I know you guys are, about this sense that the kind of extremes on both sides seem to, even though their numbers aren't that big, they seem to have all the influence. Well, this is part of your explanation. They may not be that big in number, but they're pretty engaged. They vote in the kind of like vast middle, which sometimes can be a little apathetic. They don't, and so it shouldn't surprise us that it seems like a lot of our political leaders seem to respond more to what the right or left wants than kind of what the broad middle does.
I totally understand how the extremes control a lot of the election, because many people in the middle just get disgruntled or don't vote. And as an educator for 30 years, I've advocated my students to participate in the process, and yet we still haven't seen the numbers really go up enough to counterweight or counterbalance the extremes, as you point out. But I'm not sure that the fine part would be something that I would promote or feel comfortable with. I know, as with some of my libertarian leanings, I would, even as a person who votes on almost all elections, if not all elections, I'm not sure of my record, so I don't want to misspeak, but I would feel very uncomfortable if the government passed a law that said I have to vote or I would have to pay a fine. So I am not real sure that I would promote that or that I would be in favor of that, because I think that might actually work in a negative fashion as far as getting more people to vote. Hasn't Oregon or some of these states used other methods to make it easier for people to vote, either voting online or by mail, into where, we can make it easier so that people aren't standing in line? It is more convenient, as you point out, and many times in the last couple of elections, when the lines get long, that might tend to make people not want to vote. When they look at, oh man, I can't wait for 3 hours, or I don't have 3 hours in my day to stand in line to do this. So, are there some other options out there?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to do it. And I agree. I don't think the punitive approach would be too popular here. But, there's things like, why not turn, election day into a national holiday? I mean, there's a lot of people who work kind of off hours and they got childcare. And even if the polls are open from, 7 in the morning till 7 at night, it might be a struggle for them to get there. I mean, not everybody has, if you're waiting in a long line, a couple hours to wait there to vote. So that's one thing. Another idea we propose, where the turnout problem is really acute is in the primaries. I mean, that's where you'll get turnout 10, 15% of the electorate. Part of the problem is that, whereas everybody in the country knows that the general election is always the first Tuesday in November, a lot of people don't even know when primaries are. Primary season in the U.S. extends from like March to the end of the summer. Sometimes primaries for federal office and state office are on different days. So one idea we had in there, at least for congressional primaries, was just a national primary day. That there'd just kind of be one day where everybody would know for the Senate and the House, they'd go and they'd vote in their primary election. So that would probably increase turnout. So I doubt there's any one answer to fix this, but there's definitely a couple things we could do.
So Lance and I have talked before, Ryan, about some options like online voting, or what they do in Oregon, which is, they do the mail-in ballot system, where basically if you're registered, you receive the ballot by mail and you can vote that way. So what about these ideas? I mean, are these practical in this country from a nationwide standpoint, or is there something better to look at?
Although here's the interesting thing, though. So when we were doing our research, that's an idea that sounds like very intuitive, and yeah, sure, let's vote by mail or online. But there's one problem with that that's kind of obvious, and there's one that's maybe not so obvious. So the kind of obvious one is like security, especially if you're talking about any kind of online voting. But here's the non-obvious one: it is a pretty sacred thing in our democracy. The idea that when you get into that voting booth, it is your decision, and it's a secret ballot, and nobody knows. What if, for example, you had a head of a household who was a domineering person, and he or she told their spouse and their kids, "You're going to vote for X, whether you like it or not, and I'm going to stand over your shoulder while you vote to make sure that you fill it out the way that I said." And I think that's a real concern, like that's kind of a voter privacy issue. So that was something I hadn't thought about much until I did some of the research and talked to some of the people who do voting. So that's just something to tread a little carefully.
Well, that's a great discussion, and hopefully we can find something that will work so that we can get more people to vote, and so that the middle group can be heard and its voice can kind of lead the country back to the middle where we all want to see it go. Our final question, many people might be surprised to see that earmarks or pork barrel legislation sort of is suggested in the book as a solution to restoring our democracy. Would this actually help our leaders get more done?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Earmarks, as a lot of people know, are these spending provisions that really, since the inception of Congress, that a member could put onto a bill and get passed. But they got banned in the 2000s for good reason, because there was a lot of abuse of them. Most notably, there was this famous bridge to nowhere example where this senator from Alaska got like $200 million slipped into an appropriations bill to fund a bridge that went to an island with like 50 people. And this was right at the height of the kind of Jack Abramoff and Tom DeLay corruption stuff. And then Congress just sort of said, no more earmarks. And it great. Sounds like the kind of thing that would clean up government. Here's the problem. Earmarks are one of the best tools that leaders of Congress have to incent a rank and file member of Congress to vote for something. Meaning, like, if there's a tough bill that needs to get passed, maybe it's a budget bill, whatever. If a leader can go to somebody and say, hey, I know there's that school you want to get built in your district, and we can put that in as an earmark. Now, that may sound, a little seedy to some people, but that's actually really just the typical horse trading that has existed in government forever. And as long as you do that in a transparent way, so nothing's sort of dropped in the dead of night, that's the kind of thing that kind of greases the wheel of government. It gives a member of Congress a reason to vote for something, because they can go back to their voters and they can say, hey, here's something I delivered for you. In the absence of that, it just makes it harder to generate support for legislation.
Well, and I think part of the reason this book's so great is it covers some things that are pretty straightforward and pretty common sense that I think most people, when looking at these different problems the country's facing, would say, yeah, that's just the same thing that I would come to the conclusion of. We just need our lawmakers to get it done. But then there's also some other things here like earmarks that are maybe less straightforward, or they don't come to mind for people as a way to fix gridlock. So that's part of why I think this book is so great, and why I'm sure it's going to be a good resource for our listeners. It's also important to point out that we only covered just a very few items of the book. In the interest of time, we just couldn't simply talk about everything. So if you want to pick up a copy for yourself, the book's called The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election, 101 Nonpartisan Solutions to All the Issues That Matter. It's linked at thestateofus.org. You can buy it on Amazon or anywhere else books are found. If you're interested in learning more about No Labels, the organization that Ryan works for and the organization responsible for helping make this book possible, you can go to nolabels.org, nolabels.org. They're doing some great work, lots of resources there, so be sure to check it out. Lance, we've challenged people, right, to bring others into the State of Us family by encouraging them to tune in. So if you were going to tell somebody to tune into the State of Us, what are the ways you could suggest they listen?
Well, we have my personal favorite, which is Spotify. You also have Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else that fine podcasts are found.
Thank you, Ryan Clancy, for being here with us.
Yes, Ryan, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed our discussion today. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you both for having me.
For the State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.